want to look at the materials that were used for making a Codex manuscript. And 3 different materials were actually used. Papyrus, which would always have come from Egypt. Parchment, which is animal skins. And you have parchment, which is a generic term, and then vellum, which is a term used for very, very fine parchment. We'll talk about a little bit of the differences among the parchment manuscripts. And then much later comes paper. Our earliest manuscripts of the New Testament are all written on papyrus. They were used from the 2nd century through the 7th, perhaps even 8th for New Testament manuscripts. But parchment manuscripts began to be used even perhaps as early as the 2nd century. There's 1 or 2 manuscripts that may be on parchment from the late 2nd century, and they were certainly used from the 3rd century through the 16th. Now, these parchment manuscripts would be animal skins, as I said, and they had to go through a rigorous process of skinning the parchment, scraping all the hair off. You can still see the hair follicles on one of the sides. We'll talk about the hair side versus the flesh side. And it's, in fact, possible to tell what kind of animal was used by the hair follicle patterns and some other things on these parchment leaves. And so scholars nowadays, not textual scholars, we need people that work in biology to do this, can tell what the animal actually was that was used. They can even tell, well, it's this animal and that only lived in this region, and consequently this parchment must have come from place X. What's interesting is sheep were often used, gazelles were used, deer, some other animals, but sheep were very frequent. And Codex Sinaiticus, our earliest complete New Testament, that was originally a complete Bible, would have taken at least 350 sheep to make the Codex. You think about that. You're going to have to kill 350 sheep, get their skins, eat their food, all this, and use their wool, of course, and then you can create a Bible, one of the most fabulous Bibles ever produced in history. But it takes a little bit of time to do that. Keep this in mind when we talk about the last category of parchment manuscripts today, which is going to be palimpsests, and the cost and the time involved in using a parchment leaf when you've run out of parchment for writing your manuscript. You're going to have to do this with maybe cannibalizing some older parchment that had been used for something else. Then paper manuscripts were used from the 9th through the 16th century. And until 1975, we didn't know of any paper New Testament manuscripts that were from that early. But in 1975, there was a hidden storeroom, a geniza, found at St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, Egypt. And they found among the manuscripts some 9th century paper manuscripts. We do know that the Chinese who invented paper first brought it to Egypt, but now this discovery that happened in 75 is rewriting the history of how paper got into the West. So it's fascinating just to think about that. Parchment manuscripts are going to be predominant, though. The vast majority of our manuscripts of the New Testament are written on parchment. Let's begin with some papyrus. We've talked about how papyrus was made and how you had to take these long fibers of the papyrus, beat them down, make them go perpendicular, and then they would soak them in water either for 7 or 14 days. The longer you soak it, the darker the papyrus actually gets. And the lighter color papyrus is something that we might say, oh, well, that looks better. It's easier to read because you get a stronger contrast with the ink. But it was considered not as elegant, not as fine. P46, Papyrus 1, I'm showing you here, these were written on darker papyrus. It's interesting. I don't know if that's due to the actual making of the papyrus or just due to it naturally browning over time. But when I was in Cairo, they showed me how the papyri were produced, and it was fascinating to see that. Well, this particular manuscript, we've got, this is Papyrus 1, the first one to be cataloged. It's at the University of Pennsylvania, and it's in their archaeological museum. I saw it a few years ago, and I met with the curator of the museum, and she walked me past all these massive Egyptian stone statues and other things. It was just an incredible place. And then she took me down to the basement. And, you know, museums typically have anywhere between 1 and 10% of all their belongings actually on display. The vast majority of it is underground in the basement someplace, and they kind of rotate things whenever they can find a big enough forklift. And so she takes me all the way back to the basement, a little corner, and said, here's papyrus number 1, so you can look at it. I actually was on my way out of Philadelphia. I'd been lecturing in Lancaster, and I wanted to get to Philadelphia early so I could spend some time with this papyrus. And so I'm looking at the thing, and I asked her a question. I said, so how many people come to see this? She said, oh, this is our most popular thing in the entire museum. Really? Yeah, how many visitors do you get every year? About 5. 5 visitors. It's just remarkable how, that's another topic about how we're not looking at the past anymore and thinking about this. But nevertheless, here's Papyrus 1. The first part of Matthew chapter 1 is on verso. The second part is on the recto. It's going with the fibers. We talked about this earlier, about this papyrus I looked at in Scotland that I thought may have been from Acts chapter 2 and 3 that may have been the second half of a choir suggesting there may be gospels, but that was not always the case. And not too many things could have come before Matthew chapter 1, and here's a 3rd century papyrus that starts on the verso, so they didn't always follow that pattern. So these papyri, they were used. You had a certain size of the book that you could get to. Some have suggested that the Codex form of the book was invented precisely so that you could have all 4 Gospels under one cover. T.C. Skeat, who was the curator at the British Library for many decades, he was actually working there on December 27th, 1933, when Codex Sinaiticus was brought into the British Library, and he's the one who got to publish the text in a number of ways. Skeat argued that the Codex form was invented precisely so that you could get all 4 Gospels into the book, which you could not have done in a roll. A roll could be maybe 35 feet in length at most, and we've measured out how much we could get of the New Testament books in there. One roll could hold maybe Luke or John or Acts. This tells us, by the way, that when Luke wrote his gospel in the book of Acts, he sent these out most likely at the same time, one being volume 1, the other being volume 2, simply because he couldn't put them under one roof. They couldn't be part of the same codex. And so here we have the scroll and the limitations of it. The codex can actually make a larger book. So maybe that's why papyri or the codex form was used with papyri. We're not exactly sure. When we get into parchment manuscripts, we have a little bit more information. And as I said, it was of 2 kinds. There would be parchment that would be skinned, so it's very, very ultra thin, almost translucent. You can see through the other side a little bit, so you can see the ink coming through the parchment on the other side. So you get some bleed through, and it's kind of like Bible paper today. You get the bleed through that. Bible paper is ultra thin paper that you don't get in other kinds of books, which shows deceptively how big a Bible really is. You put that on typing paper, and you're going to need to get some hernia insurance to carry it to church. So this is an image of Codex Sinaiticus, the manuscript I just mentioned that came to the British Library in 1933, discovered in 1859. It's the only 4-column codex in the world. And it's a complete New Testament, the oldest complete New Testament we have by 500 years. Discovered by Constantine von Tischendorf at St. Catherine's Monastery, Mount Sinai. I'm going to give an entire lecture just on that discovery. And what I'm showing on this page is a textual problem at Romans 5:1. But before I get there, let me just mention this. You can see thousands and thousands of images of papyrus, parchment, and paper manuscripts at the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts website. And one of the things you'll notice on these parchment images is there's going to be holes that look like oval-shaped holes for the most part, sometimes circular in the leaves. And the reason you get those holes is not that that's part of how the animal was made, or that you've got rats that have eaten through it or something like that. The holes were made by the person who is preparing the parchment for writing on. He's scraping it very thin with a crescent-shaped knife, and every once in a while he punctures the parchment, and you get a hole in there. And it's on kind of a stretched loom, and so it's going to stretch it apart, and then you get this hole. So they just write around the hole. Sometimes they'd write with the assumption that you know what word's supposed to go in the hole or what part of the word goes in the hole, and they'll just keep on going around it like that. The very finest parchment has no holes. And yet I've seen, I believe, only one manuscript that has no holes in it. Codex Sinaiticus has holes in it. Codex Vaticanus has holes. The facsimile of Codex Vaticanus, which I think is the finest facsimile in the world, there's only 450 of them, every one of them signed by Pope John Paul II on Christmas Day, 1999. If there's a hole in the manuscript, there's not a picture of a hole in the facsimile. There's a hole in the facsimile. They took an X-Acto knife and cut out these holes every single place. 450 facsimiles, just a remarkable reproduction. But Sinaiticus had holes too, and yet it was very fine vellum. So the key characteristics of vellum versus parchment is that you're not going to have very many holes, or none at all. And it's going to be thinner leaf, and it will typically be wider rather than a darker kind of parchment where they really bleach it well. What they'd often do once they put the letters on the parchment is then the scribe would go back and he'd get some egg white, mix up some egg white, and cover the text with the egg white, so it kept it glistening, and it kept the ink from getting hurt too much. So here we have Codex Sinaiticus, housed at the British Library in the Ritblat room right next to Codex Alexandrinus. And this is in the second column on that same page. This is leaf 63 verso. Now, I mentioned earlier that when it came to papyri, the verso and the recto has to do with the direction of the fibers. That's how you look at papyri. So if you're looking at it horizontally, we always call that the recto, regardless of whether that's the front of the page or the back of the page. If the fibers are going vertically, we call that the verso, whether it's the front or the back of the page, it doesn't matter. When it comes to parchment, now there's a difference. What is called the recto is always the front page. What is called the verso is always the back page. And so this is the recto of leaf 63 for the New Testament. And if you were to go to CSNTM's website, you could download this image, and you just go to 63A is I think what this is the verso, I'm sorry, so this would be 63B, column 2 near the bottom. And here we have the word echomen at Romans 5:1. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God, or let us have peace with God, Paul says. Echomen with the omega, that thing that looks like a round W in the middle, that means let us have peace with God. Echomen, you see the little O that's written above that omega? That's a change by a later scribe, apparently, who changes the omega to an omicron, and it's the difference between the subjunctive and the indicative. The original scribe wrote echomen with the omega, let us have peace. A later scribe changed it to the omicron, and that now says, we have peace. That's kind of a difference in meaning. Therefore, having been justified by faith, do we have peace, or should we have peace with God? Now, quite frankly, both of those are true, but in different senses. We do have peace with God positionally, but is Paul encouraging them to have peace in terms of their practice? What is affected here is not theology, but the exegesis, how we interpret Romans chapter 5. And Codex Sinaiticus, as helpful as we might have thought it would be, you got an original scribe that does this, and then a later scribe that does something else. Well, who is that later scribe? Well, that later scribe may have been the diorthotes. That is the person in the scriptorium who checks out the work of the scribes before it gets sent out to the new owner. And if you've ever been in school, I presume most of you have been in some sort of educational capacity, and you get a paper back from a professor, a quiz, and you see corrections on that quiz. Which one is typically considered to be the best answer? What you wrote or what your teacher wrote? Well, hopefully, unless it's a Michael's school, it's what the teacher wrote. Well, of course, then it was with Michael, so His stuff wouldn't be good either way. But typically what the teacher wrote would be better. Well, is that what we have here? Is this by the Diorthotes, the original corrector of these manuscripts before they left the monastery? It's kind of hard to tell by the handwriting. We're dealing with an O. Which guy did this? Is it that first corrector, second corrector, third, fourth, and we have different centuries and different locales for them? It's really hard to tell just from a circle what the corrector is. So it's hard for us to tell which corrector made this change. Those are some of the challenges that we face with these manuscripts and why we're not absolutely certain in every place. That's one of the major texture problems of the New Testament, Romans 5:1. Now here's a later manuscript. This is a 10th to 11th century minuscule manuscript, Codex 2882. A minuscule means it's written in a running hand where the letters connect. Lowercase letters is typically what we mean by it. And this is a manuscript that is owned by the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. I could tell you about the history of it, but I won't. I'll just tell you that this is a manuscript that only has Luke's gospel in it, but as we went through and counted the leaves, but actually transcribed the entire text, we discovered one leaf was missing. So it has the entirety of Luke except for one leaf in there, and that leaf is part of a sheet where the rest of it is part of John's gospel. But I want you to notice, you can see in the image here, you can see the hair follicles. You know, these dots on the page are the hair follicles. This is the hair side of the animal skin. And what scribes would do if they're aesthetically trying to be pleasing, and all of them just about did this, is they'd try to match the hair side to the hair side, which is always darker. And then the flesh side to another flesh side, which is always lighter because it's the inside of the animal skin. So it's more aesthetically pleasing to have the two sides match, but that took a little bit of lineup. And of course, it took a lot of scraping to get rid of the hair, so you have just the follicles left a little bit. And I want you to notice also a couple other features about this. You notice the little carets or deplays in the margin at the very top, the first 4 lines on the left side, and then those little carets a little bit later on. What that indicates is quotations from an authoritative source, in this case, the Old Testament. There are manuscripts that we have that are church fathers quoting from the New Testament, and they'll use these deplays to indicate this is quoting from the New Testament. So it's a help to the reader. Oh, this is a quotation from the Old Testament. It's very, very helpful. They did a lot of things that were helpful for readers. And then I want you to also notice you've got some letters in the margin, iota zeta, iota eta, iota theta, and what looks below it, it looks like a beta. It's hard to tell because it's very faint. It's in red. And the red lettering in second millennium manuscripts started to fade away, so it's real hard to tell. But these are known as the Eusebian canons. This was an ingenious way in which the scribes wrote out where they were in the 4 Gospels. Eusebius himself, or actually an assistant of his in the early 4th century, had this table to say, if I see these letters in the margin, that means I'm in Matthew chapter 6, this verse, and it has a parallel to Mark or Luke or John or all 3 or part of that group. This is before chapters and verses were put into the Bible. I had to figure out where they were. It's still valuable today. When we go on expeditions to photograph manuscripts and we want to find out where we are in the Gospels, we use the Eusebian canons. We have a canon list that tells us what that verse is in modern versification. So if I see iota eta over beta, I could tell, oh, this is where I am in the Gospel of Luke. It's very, very, very helpful. It's fascinating. And you'll notice also, this is much harder to see, but, well, let's see. If you go down 6 or 7 lines on the left-hand side, it looks like an O and then an I, and then the last letter is a rounded sigma, and it's got some kind of a horizontal line over the iota sigma. Can you see that about 7 lines down on the very left-hand side? That's the name Jesus, Ha Jesus. It's a nomen sacrum, that abbreviated name where they just put those 2 letters. When you put that horizontal bar over it, means don't read it as a word. Understand this symbolizes something else. And so that's how they would look at it. And finally, about 4 lines below that on the left-hand side, you can see what's called the arche, the beginning. This was a lectionary device to say this is where you start reading the passage for this particular holy day. The arche means the word beginning. And on the right-hand side in the line above it, it ends with the abbreviation for telos, or end. And so in these manuscripts, they'd mark them for Old Testament quotations. They mark them to show where they were in the Gospels. They'd mark them to show these are not words that we read, but these are actually sacred names that you're supposed to pronounce out. And they'd mark them to say this is the beginning or this is the end of what you're supposed to read for certain holy days. So these were helps for readers to see where they were and what they were supposed to do with these manuscripts. Amazing amount of information that's packed into these just little symbols that are used on these manuscripts. Really, really incredible. And yet they typically did not number the pages. So the very thing that we think is the most important, they usually left out. Here's a 2-column lectionary on paper. And I just mentioned lectionaries earlier. A lectionary was a book that is not continuous scripture, but it's a passage of scripture that would be read for a certain day. There's 2 kinds. I won't even get into the details of that, but just to point this out. You've got these 2 kinds of books, these lectionaries, where you're reading a self-contained story in the Gospels known as a pericope. It's spelled just like periscope without the S, pericope. And so they would read that whole pericope for the day. So one day might be from Matthew's Gospel. The next day might be from Luke's Gospel. Then it goes to Mark and John, back to Matthew 4 times in a row. It doesn't matter. But they had various orders that they would have to read these lectionaries in. And the lectionaries were almost always put in 2 columns. Well, why 2 columns? Well, 2 columns makes it easier for reading in public. If you have 1 column all the way across, it's very difficult. It's easy for your eyes to get tripped up and go to a different line. Notice, Sinaiticus, a 4-column manuscript. You think that was a private manuscript? Not on your life. That was meant to be read out loud in public. Just the very format of it tells us about its use. Here was a 2-column manuscript, and what I've noticed in a lot of these lectionaries, in the lower right-hand corner, it's usually much darker than it is on the rest of the manuscript. And the reason for that is because the reader who's looking at this is getting to the next page, he's doing this. Turning the page. He licks his finger. I've seen some manuscripts, paper manuscripts especially, where it's just completely eroded. There's nothing left in that lower right-hand corner. It's even eating into the text. And there's a friend of mine who owns some biblical manuscripts, and I'll have my students come over to his house sometimes, and he'll say, rule number 1, do not lick your fingers when you turn the pages. And so they've learned that well, but the old scribes and monks didn't as well. Well, I want you to notice this is a manuscript that's on paper. How can you tell apart from the fact that I told you? At the top, in the top margin on both pages, you'll see some holes. Those are wormholes. You also get severe water damage, which you don't get as much on parchment, but it's the wormholes that are a dead giveaway. Worms ate wood. Rats ate animal skin. So if you're not sure, and sometimes it's very difficult to tell, it could be a high quality paper. This is a bit of a rougher paper, but if it's a high quality paper, it's real hard to tell from a high quality vellum sheet. How can you tell? Look for the wormholes. Look for the rat holes. Is this eaten by rats or is it eaten by worms? And that's always a sure giveaway. Here's a much, much better looking paper manuscript. This is a very fine copy of a better preserved paper document without the wormholes, but you can still see the water damage. And notice the lower right-hand corner. Even as good quality as this, the scribe or the monk is licking his finger, turning the page. I have looked at and examined and prepared for photography literally hundreds of manuscripts. And I always learn something new from each one. It may be as little as, oh, he turned the page by licking his finger and putting his finger in the middle of the page, which I found in one manuscript so far only. It may be really trivial stuff, but it's always fascinating to me. You enter into the world of the scribe and you know a little bit more about what drove them and what they did. Now here's a manuscript that is not purple itself, but it was shot with UV light so that we could see the undertext. Remember I talked about how expensive it would have been to create these leaves on parchment? You take an animal, and let's say you're getting to the last few leaves of a book, and you did not make enough room, or you didn't weigh the cost of how much it would be to have enough animal skins to finish writing out that book. So you're 4 leaves short. Now you've got an existential crisis on your hands. Do you go and kill a sheep, skin it, a couple of sheep to make these four leaves? Or do you say, I'm tempted to cannibalize a manuscript that's been sitting in the corner for hundreds of years, nobody's looked at it, I bet nobody's going to miss this. And so you scrape off the text that's on that manuscript and you sew it into the back of yours, and you have, voila, a palimpsest. That's Greek for scraped again. So you take this text, because it's parchment, you can scrape it. You actually wash the letters off, then you scrape it clean, and then you write on it. And the upper text here is minuscule, the undertext is majuscule or capital letter text. UV lamps were needed to bring out the undertext. Here's a close-up of it, and you can see, oh yeah, you can actually see the capital letters under there. And so this is the kind of thing that we get every once in a while. Charlemagne actually, the practice of reusing manuscripts got to be so bad that he sent out an empire-wide edict. You can't do this anymore. Practice still continued. And to this day, there are approximately 300 palimpsest manuscripts known in Europe. A few years ago, there was a project, an international project, 26 nations, to try to figure out how to come up with the best kind of camera device to photograph these palimpsest manuscripts. And while they were shooting them, CSNTM discovered a few more. Oftentimes you can't see that undertext at all. And the only way you can tell that it's got undertext is by the feel of the page. It's a little bit rougher than the rest of it, or it looks a little bit different, cut differently, something like that. Well, let me conclude with just one last point, then we'll summarize. I want to talk about Lectionary 2258, which is in some respects the most unusual manuscript I've ever seen. Here was a magical text that was apparently pressed against a minuscule text that was the cover of a minuscule text. And then it got damp and it left a residue of letters. So here's what we're saying. You've got this book that's a minuscule text, and you've got this cover on the outside, it's all minuscule. And then you had this majuscule text that was sitting next to it on the shelf. It got damp. That ink from the majuscule text got transferred over to the minuscule text. And now it leaves a mirror image, reversed letters. That's all we have left of that majuscule text. Now, how did I discover that? This was at a place known as Matera in central Greece, magnificent place I'll tell you about later. But here I was looking at this text. I knew about the majuscule text, and it was called a palimpsest. But this time the majuscule was on top of the minuscule. Well, the minuscule text, minuscule handwriting came later than majuscule. So it's impossible. If minuscule is written later and majuscule is written earlier, how could the majuscule writing be on top of the minuscule? It has to be the other way around. And I said, I'm looking at something that's impossible, and yet there it is. And then as I looked at the letters more closely, I noticed, oh, the reverse. So many Greek letters in capital can look exactly like, whether they're forward or backwards. So it took a few before I said, oh, that's a reverse letter. That's a reverse letter. And I finally figured it out and realized that I'm looking at the back side of the top layer of parchment, where we don't have any parchment left. All we have is the ink that's been pressed against this minuscule text, and that's all we have of that manuscript. In that respect, it's the most unusual manuscript I've ever examined. It's really just fascinating. Well, let me summarize about the materials used in writing these ancient books. Parchment was by far the most durable material, followed by papyrus, and then paper. Knowing about the form of the book helps us to interpret the data, especially what would have been in the missing leaves. Thank you.
I'm asking you to raise your hand and to raise it high so that my friends can see you and get to you the simple symbol of your decision. We're going to allow this time to go on for several moments. But raise your hand and raise it high so that my friends can see you.
We want to be free.
We want to do more.
We want to lead. We want to know more.
We want to grow in Christ.
We want to follow His ways.
In His footsteps.
We want to be
disciples.